Let's go. All right. So, ladies and gentlemen, we are back again with another chapter. How exciting.
Woo!
This is chapter 6, the only valid passport from poverty. And we are going to again wow you with our information that we have for you today.
Okay. So the first thing that we're going to share are the 10 ideas that we found controversial or interesting, or that just seemed to be a really big part of the chapter. So the first one was the Brown versus Board of Education decision, which was made in May of 1954. This decision was brought to the Supreme Court, and it was basically just made to say that separate schools, like segregated schools, were inherently not equal. And so that decision meant that schools needed to start desegregating and integrating. So the next thing that was brought up in the chapter was the Civil Rights Act of 1964. And this was made 10 years after Brown versus Board of Education. And it was basically made in order to give the government the power to sue schools that hadn't started integrating yet, because the majority of the schools, especially in the South, hadn't made any moves to integrate because everyone was against the idea of integration. And so that act made the legal system able to sue those schools to get them to start taking action. The next thing that we have is the National Defense Act of 1957, and this happened because of the Soviets' launch of the Sputnik space shuttle into orbit around the Earth. And this just kind of put a fire under the butt of American education, because they saw that other countries were pulling past them, and they wanted to do something about it. And so this act pushed more emphasis on the maths and the sciences, and it gave more help to students that were excelling in those subjects, and it gave them a fire to continue to improve and to do better in these areas. The next act is kind of the other side of that, the Elementary and Secondary Education Act. This sought to help the children in more impoverished areas with their education. So whereas the National Defense Education Act, it helped more the higher achieving students, the Elementary and Secondary Education Act helped the more lower achieving and impoverished students to give them the ability to succeed in school as well. The next thing we have is Johnson's Great Society education programs. Johnson was president of the United States during this time, and he developed this Great Society plan, which helped to empower the more impoverished in America, and so that was called his Great Society, and part of that were education programs, but the book talks about how those programs were difficult to quantify the results, and they ended up ultimately failing because it was very difficult to see the results play out, because some programs seemed to work for a while, but then they ultimately failed, whereas other programs, they just could never figure out if they were working or not, and so it was a very difficult time. The desegregation of schools, which we already kind of hit on during the first two Brown v. Board of Education and the Civil Rights Act. The desegregation of schools was definitely a really big issue during this time, and it was something that really both races didn't want, which was something I was surprised about while reading this chapter. Obviously the white supremacists, they didn't really want it to happen because they thought that it wasn't fair that their students would have to go to school with people they didn't believe were adequate. But also the African Americans and other minority races didn't agree with it because they didn't want to be forced into going to school with people that hated them, and they felt like their segregated schools were okay. And what goes hand in hand with that issue over desegregation was the black teachers losing their jobs over this desegregation. They tried, a lot of African American teachers did get to keep their jobs, but they were terminated at a much higher rate than the white teachers. And so that was one of the reasons that the African American community was against the desegregation of schools, because they saw that issue coming and they didn't want it to happen. We also have the low expectations for black students in these integrated schools, because the white teachers just felt like they didn't have the potential to succeed, and so they didn't really push them as hard as they should have in order to succeed. The last 2 points go hand in hand as well, the National Teacher Corps and the continuation of missionary teaching. The National Teacher Corps was an idea that was developed during this time, and it's kind of similar to Teach for America and some of the other programs that are still around today, where basically young students are able to go into schools and they just are interns. They don't really go to college before, but they go to college as they're interning in the schools, and they learn underneath a mentor, and then they become certified after the certain amount of time that they're with that mentoring teacher. And that kind of continued along the idea of missionary teaching that we presented on last class from chapter 1, because these students and their mentoring teachers would work in more impoverished schools, and it was a way to get people who had different ideas about education into the schools to try to help to get them up to speed and to just help them have new educational tactics to help their students improve and to succeed. That's it.
Okay, so some similarities between then and now. Federal aid has been offered to schools if they follow national policies, so that was something that was really an incentive when segregation was a thing and they were trying to desegregate. They were like, we'll give you more money if you just oblige. And that's still something that we do today, not for segregation, but for other things. Programs with good intentions are really poorly implemented. So back then it was ESEA and the National Teacher Corps, and then today things like Common Core, which they had good intentions, but they're really poorly implemented and aren't doing a lot of good. There was a common belief that parental influence in the neighborhood that a kid grew up in was more significant and impactful on the kid's life than the teachers in the school system that they were in. And racism in the school system was really prominent and still is, maybe not quite as blatantly as it was. Then they blatantly fired a lot of teachers, and they were white parents were upset and complaining because they didn't think that black teachers were adequate enough to teach their kids. And today, it's definitely not that prominent, but the percentage of black educators has dropped 10% from 2000 to 2010.
Some differences: segregation in the school system, which is something we obviously don't see today. And then black schools were often very poor and lacked extracurricular activities, no lunchtime, and no athletic equipment. Blatant racism between parents and educators, while parents didn't think black teachers were educated enough to properly instruct their children. And then there was resentment between veteran teachers and new teachers through the National Teacher Corps.
All right, so we have a couple major players and change agents that appeared during this time. And first off, we have Chief Justice Earl Warren. So I want you all to just take a minute and just listen to the words that he said when he put his judicial opinion in about the Brown versus Board of Education. I have them right here highlighted because they're super significant. Listen to this. It says, segregation of white and colored children in public schools has a detrimental effect upon the colored children. The impact is greater when it has the sanction of the law, for the policy of separating the races is usually interpreted as denoting the inferiority of the Negro group. We conclude that in the field of public education, the doctrine of separate but equal has no place. Separate educational facilities are inherently unequal. And so the important thing about this is that judicial opinion is one of the most quoted judicial opinions in history. And as I thought about it, I was like, it's kind of true, because you look back, you can look on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, wherever, and people quote it all the time. You don't even have to look on social media. People quote it all the time. And it's his words that really changed the face of education. And all the other justices that worked with him also were change agents, but he was probably the most prominent one because of his memorable words that he wrote. The second person is Lyndon B. Johnson, and he is by far my favorite change agent because I love presidents and I love presidential history. And so I was like, my bro Johnson is in the house, and I was super excited. And he did a lot in the White House, but what I really want to touch on is what he did before he entered the White House. And that is, he taught in Texas, and he was actually an educator. And what he did was he went to this school called Wellhausen, and it was mainly Mexican-American kids that didn't have a lot of resources, that came from low-income families. So when he first started teaching, one of the most interesting things he did was he sent a letter to his mom asking for 250 tubes of toothpaste because the children didn't have toothpaste. And so he was in shock at the lack of resources they had. And so as he was teaching there, he worked up the ranks, and he ended up becoming the principal of the school. And when he was the principal, he changed the school entirely. what he did was he implemented a couple of rules that really helped change education, especially at that school. First off, he required teachers to stay back and help kids that needed extra help, like tutoring. And he said that was a requirement. Teachers can't go home early, you have to stay behind because these kids need help. And second, he implemented it's okay, no problem. He implicated a no English policy. An all English policy. The all English policy was that all the kids, a lot of them didn't speak English. And so he wanted them to learn the language. And so he didn't allow them to speak Spanish at all. And every time he heard someone speak Spanish, he would go up and spank them, literally. And all the kids remember that. He was pretty brutal as a principal. He did not want to hear Spanish at all. So he was very strict in his implementations of the rules. But he was also remembered as a really key person at that school because he changed the education there forever, which was awesome. And then he took that passion to the White House, which was awesome too. So he was formerly an educator, which is why he's a change agent. And third, Joan Wofford. She was a Washington, D.C. school teacher. She taught at Cardozo High School. And Cardozo High School was located in Columbia Heights, Washington, D.C. It was a low-income school, and when she went there, it was predominantly African-American. All the teachers were African-American, all the students were African-American. She was only the second white teacher to join the school. When she got there, she was in awe of the type of teaching that went down there. Because a lot of the teachers, they had the mindset of, oh, okay, so I'm going to teach here for a couple of years and then move on. And they wanted to go to higher income schools. And so it was only, the job at Cardozo was only temporary. And that shocked her. The other thing that shocked her was their discipline for the students as well. Because the interesting thing is they would sometimes, like during lunch or during free time, the students would walk through the hallways and the teachers would walk through the hallways, and every time the teacher would see a student with a hat on, they'd yell at him and say, take it off. Also, I don't know if you guys have experienced this, I'm sure everybody's experienced this, but you have your family pictures or your friend pictures, and every time you have a picture, you take a serious one and you take a funny one. And at Cardozo High School, there were no funny pictures. As a matter of fact, every time they take group pictures as students, and like, you know, you have your students and your teacher, and they take the memorable picture, it was serious. And every time a student would move or flinch or do something out of the ordinary, the teachers would seriously put it down and say, no, we need to have order and structure. And it was too much order for Joan Wofford. And so it blew her mind. And she said, I want energy here. I want people to be excited. I want teachers to actually be excited about teaching and want to stay in these areas. So what she did was she started the Cardozo Project. And what that was, basically, she thought, okay, how about this? Let's take some Peace Corps veterans. And when I say Peace Corps veterans, I mean still they were young. They weren't older, but they were workers of the Peace Corps. Let's bring them over to this low income school, and let's have them teach, because they can bring new ideas, and they can have veteran teachers at Cardozo stay there and mentor these young teachers. And so she got funding from the government, and she also worked with the Peace Corps, got some teachers to come over, and they started working with the students. And what they would do is they would offer new ideas. They would offer ideas that really weren't seen at all in the school before. And then the veteran teachers would kind of keep tradition, some traditional ideas, and keep them at bay a little bit. And so it was a neat idea, because what she thought of was, let's come up with a way to make low-income teaching a thing. Like, let's make it to where teachers don't want to just come to this low-income area for a few years and then leave. We want them to stay. We want them to invest in these children because they need it. And so her idea really impacts today, because think about it. In a couple of years, what are we going to do? Student teach. And she may not have been the first person to think about this, but I guarantee you she was one of the first. And I feel like if she didn't come up with this amazing blueprint of of teachers going in and having mentors, I don't think that we would have the same kind of structure that we do today, where future teachers have mentors that they learn from. And so her idea was revolutionary. And all three of these people, especially my boy Johnson, they had amazing impacts on education, and they were definitely change agents, and they deserved it.
I'm gonna follow that up. So, so we had wanted to see the perspective of how teachers and education was viewed during this time, and some of the stuff we just were given examples of is education at this time was only given to the white privileged students, and though it was given to the African American students, there was a very big difference in the resources they had. The textbooks that the African American students had were very worn out, and they weren't even in date, and they did not have, like I said earlier in the slide, no lunchtime, no athletic resources, nothing. And also again in this chapter there was the Brown versus the Board of Education trial going on. And throughout the chapter we see big steps being taken by integrating schools, giving African Americans the right to vote, and other laws being passed, such as the ESEA. And so we kind of talked about that and how this was one of the programs that Johnson implemented, and with as many others, they weren't very successful, but they did try to implement, like they had good intentions, they just weren't played out as well and put into place as good as they could have been. And though things were changing very slowly, there was still some progress made in their efforts. During this time, we see President Johnson push the anti-poverty aggressively in Congress. He believed that in order to help education advance, you had to start at home. Which was interesting about this point is we talked about how he taught in Texas. So when he was passing these laws and stuff, he actually, when he was passing it, he brought his elementary school teacher with him and kind of got her input and insight on what was going on and what you need to do, because it all has to start at home. So you can't just push like always and expect them to understand and push it in the classroom. There has to be some type of change at home, which implemented food stamps and welfare and so on. Though they were not all successful, there was one that was successful, was integrating the Southern public schools. There were issues that only black teachers were suited for black students, and white teachers can only teach white students. This led to the black teachers getting fired or demoted even after the progress of integration. So what was happening there was you had parents who didn't think that their kids should be taught by black teachers, and so they were fired, or even if they weren't fired, they were put into a different, they were demoted to a different section, and it was also, when they were demoted, it was subjects they didn't have expertise in, so they would get bad reviews, bad feedback or whatever, and so then they would get fired. So it was almost an intentional thing. So even though they didn't lose their jobs, they still weren't being supported by their teachers.
Okay, so some problems and impacts. We talked about segregation a lot already, and Brown versus Board of Education, and many teachers lost their jobs, and the diversity in the school system was lost because of this, because African American students felt like they didn't have like that African American leader to look up to in their school.
And nobody wanted the schools to be desegregated, and they were very angry about it. When we were discussing like going and making the Prezi last night, I think it was Lorraine that said black people didn't want to be forced to be loved, and white people didn't want to force to love, which kind of is a big thing about Brown versus Board of Education. And the last one is that Southern states modified their constitution to abolish the right to public education, just because they weren't wanting to give equal opportunity to black students as they were white students.